Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the stories you probably heard as a kid, the ones with all the glitter and the promises of happily ever after. But let's be real for a second. Back in the day, before indoor plumbing and reliable dental care, life was, well, it was rough. So those sweet little tales your grandma told you, chances are, the original versions were about as pleasant as a root canal without anesthesia. You're probably picturing a charming prince on a white horse. Right, more likely. He'd arrive smelling of stale ale and his horse would have worms, and that beautiful princess, she'd probably be more concerned with avoiding smallpox than attending a ball. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know, down in the comments, where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are in a forest, not the vibrant, lush kind you see in picture books. This is a dark, damp place where sunlight struggles to penetrate the thick canopy above. The smell of damp earth and decay fills your nostrils. You trudge along a path strewn with rocks and gnarled roots, occasionally stumbling. Rustling sounds emanate from the undergrowth, perhaps just a foraging squirrel. But it could also be something larger, something more predatory, lurking just out of sight. Fairy tales often begin in some idyllic setting, a peaceful village, a magnificent castle, or a humble cottage in the woods. But ask yourself, what was life really like in those places? Do you envision quaint villages with cosy thatched roof houses and simple folk, perhaps? But you should also picture muddy roads after heavy rains, the stench of poorly disposed waste, and weary farmers with calloused hands toiling endlessly just to survive another day. Life expectancy was notoriously low. Diseases ran rampant, and even a minor cut could lead to a fatal infection. Historians still debate whether life was truly healthier before widespread urbanization, but it was undoubtedly far harsher than our romanticized notions. As for magnificent castles, do you think of grand halls, lavish banquets, and splendid gowns? Certainly, those elements existed, but you should also consider cold, drafty rooms, poor lighting, and rudimentary heating systems. Even royalty faced illnesses that we can now easily cure. And the brutal truth is, their power was often built upon the oppression and exploitation of the common folk. A quirky, lesser-known detail is that in the Middle Ages, frequent bathing was often considered unhealthy, and even royal figures could go weeks, or even months, without a proper wash, still picturing a sweet-smelling, chivalrous prince. And those humble cottages in the woods, they sound romantic. A peaceful retreat amidst nature. But think about the isolation, the self-sufficiency required to find food, to fend off wild animals, and to endure harsh weather. There were no convenience stores around the corner, no doctors when you fell ill. Survival depended entirely on your wits and sheer luck. A common historical fact is that the vast majority of Europe's population for centuries lived in rural settings, and their lives were often a continuous struggle for existence. So, here you are in this forest. Perhaps you are a lost child, a runaway, or an unlucky hunter. Whoever you are, the brutal reality of the fairy tale world surrounds you. No magic wand will instantly solve your problems. You must rely on your own cunning, strength, and courage to navigate your way through. You might hear birdsong somewhere, but it's not a melodious, comforting sound. It's just part of nature's harsh symphony, a constant reminder of life and death. You probably wouldn't survive on pretty illusions alone. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Don't worry, we'll get to that later. You continue to walk, trying to orient yourself in the increasingly dim forest. Shadows begin to lengthen between the trees, and strange sounds echo around you, sending shivers down your spine. You feel hungry, thirsty, and exhausted. Is there someone waiting for you at the end of this path, or will you simply get lost and become a meal for some wild beast? This is not the fairy tale you grew up hearing. This is reality, raw and unvarnished. You glance up at the sky, attempting to gauge the time. The sun has disappeared behind thick clouds, and you're unsure how long you've been walking. A sense of unease grows within you. You wish you had a lantern, a knife, anything to make you feel safer. But you only have the clothes on your back and a faint flicker of hope. Hope. That's what fairy tales often offer. But even hope can be cruel if it's not grounded in reality. You might hope for a miracle, a sudden rescuer to appear. But what happens if no one comes? What do you do when hope finally flickers out? Historians still debate whether belief in magic and the miraculous truly helped. People endure past hardships or simply served as a way to escape harsh realities. You stop, listening. The wind rustling through the leaves sounds like whispers. You have the distinct feeling that something is watching you. Perhaps it's just your imagination playing tricks on you, but you can't shake the unsettling sensation. You try to recall the fairy tales you once knew. Beautiful princesses rescued, brave princes defeating monsters, sweet happy endings, but now, in this dark forest, those stories seem distant and meaningless. You wonder, what happened to all those characters after they got there, happily ever after? Did they truly live fulfilling lives, or did they, too, face hardships, losses, and disappointments like everyone else? You begin to realize that happily ever after was probably just a sweet deception. A way to conclude a story before the real challenges began. You continue your journey, filled with skepticism and a touch of fear. The forest seems endless, and the darkness deepens. You know you must find shelter before night completely falls, but you don't know where it's safe, and you don't know if you have the strength to continue. The brutal reality of the fairy tale world weighs heavily on your shoulders, and you begin to understand that to survive, you must abandon illusions and confront the truth. You've made it through the night. Barely. The sounds of the forest settled into a chilling symphony of rustles and distant howls, and every snapped twig made you jump. You huddled against the trunk of a gnarled oak, the rough bark digging into your back, and shivered. Not just from the cold, but from the raw, exposed feeling of being utterly alone in a world that doesn't care for happily ever afters. As the first faint streaks of dawn pierce the heavy canopy, casting long, eerie shadows, you begin to understand that the stories you were told were just pretty lies, designed to lull children to sleep, not to prepare them for the true grit and grimness of survival. Because the truth is, the tales weren't always so sanitized. Before the Brothers Grimm smoothed out the edges, before Disney added the singing birds and the sparkly dresses, these were stories born from a brutal world, steeped in the fears and realities of medieval life. You might think of Cinderella as a sweet tale of a downtrodden girl finding her prince, but the original versions, oh, they were something else entirely. Imagine, for instance, Cinderella's stepsisters. In some tellings, literally cutting off parts of their feet to fit into the glass slipper. One slices off her heel, another her toe, all in a desperate, gruesome attempt to fool the prince. You can almost hear the squelch. Can't you? It's the kind of dedication to a fairy tale ending that would make a modern plastic surgeon wince. This wasn't just about vanity. It was about social climbing, about escaping a life of drudgery and marrying into power, no matter the cost. A common historical fact is that arranged marriages for strategic alliances, particularly among the upper classes, were the norm for centuries, far removed from any notion of romantic love. And then there's the pigeons. In some versions, it's a flock of doves that peck out the stepsisters' eyes at Cinderella's wedding, leaving them blind as punishment for their wickedness. You can almost see them stumbling, screaming, their vision replaced by eternal darkness. That's a far cry from a fairy godmother turning a pumpkin into a carriage, isn't it? It's a stark, visceral form of justice, reflective of an era when punishments were often public and brutal, designed to serve as a deterrent. Historians still debate whether the gruesome elements in early fairy tales primarily served as moral warnings or simply reflected the harsh realities and brutal justice systems of the times. Consider Sleeping Beauty. You know, the one prick your finger. Fall asleep. Wait for a prince. Sounds enchanting. Right, well, in Giambattista Basile's Sun, Moon and Talia, the earliest known literary version, the sleeping princess, Talia, isn't woken by a kiss. Instead, a king, finding her asleep, assaults her. She gives birth to twins while still unconscious, and one of them, sucking on her finger, draws out the splinter of flax that caused her slumber. She wakes to find two babies she doesn't recognize, the queen, the king's wife. Later tries to have Talia and her children burned alive and even served to the king as a meal. It's a tale steeped in abduction, betrayal, and attempted cannibalism. Suddenly, a little prick from a spinning wheel doesn't seem so bad, does it? The idea of a passive female character at the mercy of male power was disturbingly common in these early narratives, reflecting a patriarchal society where women often had little agency. And Hansel and Gretel. You probably imagine a sweet old witch in a gingerbread house, but think about the sheer desperation that would drive parents to abandon their own children in the woods in the first place. This wasn't just a plot device, it was a grim reality for many impoverished families during times of famine, in periods of extreme scarcity. Infanticide or child abandonment were not unheard of, though certainly horrific and often driven by the agonizing choice between the survival of a few or the starvation of all. A lesser-known detail from some folk versions is that the parents weren't necessarily evil. They were simply starving and saw no other option for their own survival. So, the moment you step into that gingerbread house, the smell of sweet pastries is instantly undercut by the stench of desperation and a very real understanding of hunger. Even Little Red Riding Hood, a cautionary tale about talking to strangers, had far more chilling beginnings. In some of the earliest oral versions, the wolf doesn't just eat Grandma and Red, he tricks Red Riding Hood into eating Grandma's flesh and drinking her blood. And then, he tells her to strip naked and get into bed with him. This version, often called the story of Grandmother, contains no woodcutter, no happy rescue. Red Riding Hood has to use her wits to escape, tricking the wolf into letting her go outside to relieve herself, and then she simply runs away. It's a narrative about a young girl's cunning and survival against a truly predatory force, a stark contrast to the passive victim awaiting rescue. It makes you wonder if our modern stranger danger talks are a little too polite. These original versions weren't written down for children in cosy beds. They were passed orally among adults, often around the hearth in dimly lit hovels, serving as warnings, as entertainment, and as a way to process the brutal realities of their lives. They were filled with fear of starvation, fear of predatory animals, fear of cruel lords, and fear of the unknown. The monsters weren't just mythical beasts, they were thinly veiled metaphors for famine, disease, war, and the harshness of human nature. Think about the psychological toll these stories must have taken. Imagine hearing about children being abandoned, about cannibalism, about brutal mutilations, all before the advent of any kind of psychological counselling. It puts a whole new spin on the idea of bedtime stories, doesn't it? You might have thought you were just learning about good triumphing over evil, but you were actually internalizing the very real terrors of a pre-industrial world. You were being prepared, in a twisted way, for a life where survival often meant making impossible choices or facing unspeakable horrors. The vivid, often gruesome, imagery served to hammer home moral lessons and to instill a healthy fear of the world's dangers. Even the seemingly innocuous details carried weight. The deep, dark woods in every story. They weren't just picturesque settings. They represented very real dangers, wolves, bears, outlaws, and the very real possibility of getting lost and starving to death. The lack of proper roads or maps meant that venturing too far from known paths was a life-threatening decision. So when you hear about a character entering the forest, you should feel a primal sense of dread, not just anticipation of an adventure. The transformation of these tales into something more palatable for children began much later, as societies became more civilized, or at least tried to appear so. The Grimm brothers, for instance, collected many of these folk tales in the 19th century, and even they, over multiple editions, began to soften the more gruesome elements, adding Christian morals and simplifying complex narratives. They knew their audience was shifting, and the purpose of the tales was evolving from raw cultural expression to moral instruction for the rising middle class. An obscure detail here is that the Grimms meticulously documented their sources, but they also admitted to altering the stories for purity and appropriateness over time, making them more suitable for a burgeoning child readership. So, the next time you picture a shimmering ball gown or a glass slipper, remember the blood and the desperation that likely paved the way for those iconic images. Remember the stepsisters, blinded and limping, or the king who took advantage of a sleeping princess. Because these aren't just stories, they're echoes of a time when happily ever after was less a promise and more a desperate prayer, whispered in the darkness of a world that was far from fairy tale perfect. You're starting to see the true colours, the grim realities that lie just beneath the shimmering surface of the tales you thought you knew, and it makes you wonder if the beginnings were this brutal. What really happened after the wedding? You've moved deeper into the fragmented echoes of these ancient tales, the raw edges of reality still pricking at your subconscious. The chill of the early morning forest slowly gives way to a faint warmth as the sun rises higher. But the comfort is fleeting. You're no longer merely observing, you're immersed in the disquieting truth that the damsels in distress weren't just waiting patiently for a charming prince. Their lives, even if they were royalty, were often a brutal gauntlet of powerlessness, political manoeuvring, and a desperate struggle for agency in a world that largely denied it to them. Think of Rapunzel, locked away in a tower. Your mind probably conjures images of long, flowing hair and a wistful song. But let's get real. Imagine being confined to a single room, day in and day out, with no human contact except for one tyrannical woman. The isolation alone would be maddening. You'd lose track of days, of yourself. Then, consider the practicalities of that ridiculously long hair. It would be heavy, tangled, probably crawling with lice. The smell alone, without regular washing, would be, well, let's just say a prince climbing it might reconsider his romantic notions. The tower wasn't just a metaphor for isolation, it was a prison, a physical manifestation of a woman's total lack of freedom. An obscure detail from some versions, particularly older Germanic ones, reveals that Rapunzel's downfall isn't just the witch discovering the prince, it's Rapunzel herself, in her naivete, accidentally revealing her pregnancy to the witch by complaining about her clothes no longer fitting. This detail paints her not just as a victim, but as a young woman tragically unprepared for the harsh consequences of a world that offered few protections. And what happens next, in the more brutal versions? The witch doesn't just banish Rapunzel, she blinds the prince, often by throwing him from the tower and having thorns poke out his eyes. So you have a pregnant, banished, possibly traumatized young woman wandering blindly through a desert, and a prince who is now blind and desolate. Their happily ever after is contingent on years of suffering, wandering, and then, miraculously, Rapunzel's tears healing his eyes. It's a miracle born of immense pain, not the gentle magic of a fairy godmother. This reflects a common-held historical fact: women, particularly young women, had virtually no control over their own bodies, their marriages, or their destinies. They were often pawns in familial or political games, their value tied primarily to their fertility and their ability to produce heirs. Then there's Snow White, The Disney version gives you cute dwarves and a poisoned apple. The original Grimm version much more gruesome. The evil queen doesn't just want Snow White gone, she wants her heart and liver, to eat them. Believing they will give her youth and power, you can practically taste the bitter metallic tang of such a desperate meal. This isn't just vanity, it's a primal, almost ritualistic consumption, indicative of a deep-seated fear of aging and losing power in a society where a woman's beauty was often her only currency. The huntsman, thankfully, brings her a boar's heart instead. But imagine the sheer terror for Snow White, knowing her own stepmother wanted to literally consume her, and the ending. In some versions, the evil queen isn't simply banished or dies falling off a cliff. At Snow White's wedding, she's forced to wear red-hot iron shoes and dance until she dies. You can almost smell the burning flesh, hear the agonizing screams as she's made to suffer a public, torturous death. It's a spectacle of retribution, a gruesome justice that leaves no room for pity. This extreme punishment highlights a prevailing societal belief in an eye-for-an-eye retribution, where justice was often less about rehabilitation and more about public display and severe vengeance. Historians still debate whether such gruesome punishments were genuinely widespread, or if they were exaggerated in folklore to emphasize moral lessons and deter perceived wrongdoing. Think about the princess from The Frog Prince. In the modern versions, she sweetly kisses the frog. In the Grimm version, she's so disgusted by the slimy creature that she throws him against a wall or a bed, and that's what breaks the spell. It's an act of revulsion, not tenderness. It speaks to the utter lack of choice these princesses often had, forced into repulsive situations, often betrothals they loathed, simply because of a promise or a perceived obligation. The thought of having to spend the night with a cold, damp frog, or even worse, a man who transformed from such a creature, would be enough to make anyone act out. It's a moment of raw, uncensored disgust, a very human reaction to an unpleasant situation, far from the stoic, perfectly polite princesses we see today. You might even find yourself chuckling at the sheer ooh factor of it all. These princesses weren't always pure, docile figures. They were often flawed, sometimes naive, sometimes cruel, and always subject to the whims of men and the rigid societal structures around them. Their beauty was often a curse, attracting unwanted attention or becoming the source of bitter jealousy. Their royal birth was often a gilded cage, trapping them in political marriages to strangers, sometimes to men much older, much cruder, or much less appealing than any fairy tale prince. The very concept of love as a basis for marriage was a relatively modern invention for centuries. It was a practical arrangement. Consider the pervasive threat of rape and assault in these older tales, often implicitly or explicitly present. Sleeping Beauty with the king's actions, or Little Red Riding Hood with the wolf's predatory advances. These weren't simply cautionary tales about strangers. They reflected very real dangers for women in a world where protection was scarce and legal recourse often non-existent. The vulnerability of women was a constant theme, making their happy endings even more precarious and often dependent on external forces rather than their own actions. You can almost feel the pervasive sense of insecurity that would have defined daily life for many women. Even the acts of kindness shown to these princesses often came with a price, or were born out of a twisted sense of pity. When Snow White finds refuge with the dwarves, it's a temporary reprieve, not a permanent solution. They take her in, but she's still responsible for domestic chores. A stark reminder that even in safety, a woman's place was often defined by service. You can imagine the smell of simmering stew and dirty mining clothes permeating the small cottage, a far cry from a sparkling palace. The shift in these stories, from dark, visceral warnings to saccharine morality plays, says a lot about changing societal values and the increasing focus on childhood as a protected, innocent phase of life, but by sanitizing them, we've lost touch with the raw, brutal truths that these tales originally conveyed. We've replaced the gritty realities of survival, desperation, and vengeance with pretty wishes and magic wands, and in doing so, we might have lost some of the wisdom these tales held, not the wisdom of magical solutions, but the wisdom of understanding human nature in its darkest corners, and the sheer grit required to navigate a world that offered little in the way of comfort or justice. So, as you continue your journey through these fractured narratives, remember that the princesses of old weren't just waiting for their prince. They were battling for their lives, their sanity, and any shred of dignity they could claw back in a world that often saw them as property or pawns. Their struggles were real, their suffering often profound, and their happy endings, if they came at all, were hard-won and often tainted by the horrors they had endured. You've survived the chilling revelations about the princesses, a new layer of grim reality settling over the romantic haze you once associated with them. The sun is now higher, casting dappled light through the leaves, but the air still holds a damp chill, a subtle reminder of the harshness of this historical landscape. If the female protagonists endured such grim fates, what about the men? You might imagine them all as noble, brave, and inherently good, the shining heroes destined to conquer evil and sweep the fair maiden off her feet. But you're starting to learn that in these older tales, no one truly escaped the brutal realities, and the princes, knights, and kings were often just as flawed, desperate, or even cruel as the villains they were meant to oppose. Consider the charming prince in many of these stories. He's often depicted as the epitome of virtue, but his motivations in the original narratives were rarely about true love. Remember Cinderella. The prince wasn't exactly smitten by her personality. He was holding a ball specifically to find a bride, often driven by political necessity or dynastic succession. His quest for the slipper-wearing maiden was less about a deep connection and more about identifying the woman who fit a very specific, almost objectifying, criteria. He was looking for a match, not necessarily a soulmate. A common historical fact is that royal marriages were almost exclusively strategic alliances, designed to consolidate power, acquire land, or secure peace. Personal affection was a bonus, not a prerequisite. Then there's the sheer lack of self-awareness. Remember how the stepsisters mutilated their feet for the slipper in some versions. It's not the talking birds or a hidden magical force that reveals the deception. It's the prince himself, walking through blood-soaked slippers not once, but twice, before he finally gets the hint. You'd think a man capable of ruling a kingdom would notice something was a little off about a shoe filled with gore, wouldn't you? It's almost comical in its grossness, a truly face-palm moment from centuries past. This isn't the sharpest tool in the royal shed, is he? And what about the princes who weren't so charming? Take the king in Basil's son, Moon, and Talia, the original Sleeping Beauty. He doesn't kiss her awake, he finds her, takes advantage of her unconscious state, and then leaves. He only remembers her months later when his own children, born from that brutal encounter, need a wet nurse. This isn't a hero, it's a powerful man exercising his perceived right over another's body, reflecting a disturbing reality of the time where women, especially those without male protectors, were incredibly vulnerable. The happily ever after for Talia comes only after the king's jealous wife attempts to murder her and her children. This prince isn't just flawed, he's morally ambiguous at best, and a perpetrator at worst, highlighting the stark power imbalances prevalent in the feudal era. Historians still debate whether such narratives were meant to critique the behaviour of the powerful or simply reflected an acceptance of the brutal realities of aristocratic privilege. Even seemingly benevolent male figures had their own harsh realities to contend with. Consider the various kings and fathers who, in tales like King Lear or Donkey Skin, sometimes make terrible decisions out of hubris, despair, or even perverse desires. A father attempting to marry his own daughter because she's the only one beautiful enough to replace his deceased wife, as in Donkey Skin, paints a disturbing picture of patriarchal control and psychological dysfunction within the ruling class. This wasn't a hero. This was a man whose power enabled horrifying actions, even if the story ultimately ends with divine intervention or a different prince. The psychological undercurrents of incest and taboo were often explored in these dark tales, perhaps as a way to process societal anxieties about unchecked power. Then there are the heroes, who aren't really heroes at all, but simply survivors or even opportunists. Many male characters, like Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk, aren't driven by grand ideals but by poverty and desperation. Jack tricks a giant, steals his treasures and ultimately kills him, while presented as a victory over evil. You can also see it as a tale of cunning and theft, motivated by the dire need to feed his family. He's not a knight in shining armour. He's a commoner, driven by necessity, using his wits to survive in a world where opportunities for advancement were scarce and often required unethical means. This reflects a lesser-known detail about folk heroes. They often embody a kind of trickster archetype, succeeding not through brute strength or noble deeds, but through cleverness and sometimes outright deception, appealing to a common audience who had to outwit their powerful overlords. And let's not forget the sheer violence many of these male characters inflicted or endured. Knights went to war, not just to rescue princesses, but for land, glory, and often out of feudal obligation. Battles were bloody, brutal affairs, with disease often killing more men than swords. The stench of a battlefield, the cries of the wounded, the fear of death by a rusty blade or an infected wound, these were the realities behind the valiant deeds. When a prince slays a dragon or a villain, imagine the roar, the heat, the stench of blood and fire, and the very real danger of being burned alive or dismembered. It wasn't clean Hollywood combat. This was visceral, messy, and terrifying. Even the concept of chivalry itself, often associated with these heroic male figures, was far more complex and often contradictory than popular culture suggests. While it involved ideals of honour and protection, it was primarily a code of conduct for medieval knights, often limited to their interactions with other nobles or certain classes of women, and frequently disregarded in warfare or dealings with commoners. So, while a knight might be chivalrous towards a noble woman, he might be entirely ruthless towards a peasant or a defeated enemy. You might get a kick out of how often the noble acts in these tales were simply adherence to a very specific, and often self-serving, social contract. So, the next time you picture a shining hero, remember the complexities and brutal truths of their world. They were men shaped by the same harsh realities as everyone else: hunger, disease, war, and the rigid social hierarchies that dictated their lives. Their heroism was often a mix of desperation, duty, cunning, and sometimes outright cruelty. Their happy endings were not guaranteed by destiny, but carved out through struggle, often at great cost to themselves and others. The tales remind us that even the most powerful male figures were products of their time, far from the sanitized, perfect archetypes we often see today. You're starting to strip away the layers, revealing the human, all too human, figures beneath the regal robes and armour. You've peeled back layers of illusion, understanding now that neither princesses nor princes were spared the gritty reality of their times. The forest around you, which once seemed a place of magic and possibility, now whispers tales of struggle and cunning, a constant reminder that survival was rarely romantic. As the midday sun streams down, cutting sharp lines through the canopy, you're confronted with perhaps the most enduring myth of all, the promise of happily ever after in our modern minds. This phrase conjures images of eternal bliss, perfectly content couples, and a life free from conflict. But in the historical context of these original tales, marriage was rarely the culmination of romantic love and certainly not the end of all troubles. Instead, it was often the beginning of a whole new set of brutal realities. Imagine a royal wedding in these times. You might picture gleaming silks, joyous feasts, and declarations of undying love. The reality was often far less glamorous, for most, especially those of noble birth. Marriage was a political and economic contract, not a choice of the heart. You, the princess, might be married off to a prince from a rival kingdom to secure peace, consolidate power, or expand territory. Your personal feelings were utterly irrelevant. You might never have met your future spouse before the wedding day, and when you did, he could be much older, disfigured, or simply repulsive. An obscure detail from historical accounts is that royal brides were sometimes sent with a marriage bed, already prepared and inspected by their new household, to ensure they were fertile and capable of producing heirs. A truly dehumanizing start to a union. And what did happily ever after look like after the ceremony? It certainly wasn't lounging around a castle, dreaming of roses. For noble women, your primary duty was to produce male heirs. Failure to do so could lead to significant pressure, disgrace, or even annulment and banishment. Every pregnancy was a gamble, with childbirth being one of the leading causes of death for women. You'd be surrounded by midwives and servants, but medical knowledge was primitive, and infection was always a terrifying threat. You can almost feel the sweat, the pain, the absolute vulnerability of childbirth in a pre-antibiotic era. No amount of royal lineage could protect you from puerperal fever. For a moment, let's step into the shoes of a commoner. If you were a peasant, your marriage might be arranged by your parents to merge small plots of land or to ensure a workforce for the family farm. Love was a luxury you couldn't afford. Your days would be filled with relentless labour tilling fields, harvesting crops, tending livestock, grinding grain, and weaving cloth. Your home would be a humble dwelling, often shared with animals, with little privacy. The concept of personal space was practically non-existent. You might be working side by side with your spouse, day in and day out, in a constant battle against hunger, disease, and the whims of your feudal lord. Your happily ever after was surviving another winter, seeing your children reach adulthood, and perhaps having enough food on the table. Historians still debate whether the close-knit, community-focused lives of medieval peasants fostered a different kind of happiness, rooted in shared struggle and collective survival, distinct from modern individualistic notions. Consider the reality of domestic life, even in castles. Cleanliness was a major challenge. Pests like fleas, lice, and rats were ubiquitous. Sanitation systems were rudimentary at best, leading to unpleasant odours and the constant threat of disease. Imagine sharing your bed with unexpected scurrying visitors. Meals might be lavish for the wealthy, but they were often heavy, lacked variety, and food preservation was rudimentary, leading to frequent spoilage. The romantic ideal of a prince and princess sharing a delicate meal is quickly shattered by the thought of greasy, overcooked meat and stale bread. You might even find yourself wishing for a modern fast food burger. And then there's the power dynamic within marriage. Historically, the husband held almost absolute authority. A wife was legally considered her husband's property. She had few rights to her own possessions, property, or even her own children. Disobedience could lead to physical abuse, which was often considered a husband's right to correct his wife. This isn't the playful banter of modern romantic comedies. This is a stark, often brutal, reality of patriarchal control. The Taming of the Shrew wasn't just a play by Shakespeare, it was a societal expectation. This common historical fact underlines the legal and social subjugation of women in most pre-modern societies. What about infidelity? In an era where marriage was about lineage and property, adultery, particularly by the wife, was a grave offence, threatening the legitimacy of heirs and the purity of bloodlines. Punishments for women could be severe, ranging from public shaming to imprisonment or even death. For men, the consequences were often far less stringent, highlighting the double standards deeply embedded in these societies. This harsh reality underscores how precarious a woman's happy ever after truly was, constantly at risk from suspicion or accusation. Even the most seemingly idyllic happy ever after in these tales often conceals underlying trauma. Think of characters like Beauty from Beauty and the Beast. She ends up with the prince, but she's essentially been held captive, even if kindly, and forced to choose between her family and a monstrous figure. The psychological impact of such an experience, even with a magical transformation at the end, would be profound. You don't just get over something like that, it leaves scars. The fairy tale glosses over the complex emotional landscape that would truly follow such an ordeal. The purpose of marriage in these old stories wasn't to portray personal fulfillment, but to signify social order restored, alliances forged, and the continuation of a bloodline. The kiss wasn't about passion, it was a seal on a transaction. The ball was a marketplace. The white wedding dress, a much later invention, didn't symbolise purity but a demonstration of wealth and status. An obscure detail for you until relatively recently. A white wedding dress was not the norm. Brides often wore their best dress, whatever colour it might be, reflecting the practicalities of a less affluent society. So, when you hear, "and they lived happily ever after," understand it as a euphemism, a narrative shortcut. It means the immediate crisis was averted, the societal order re-established, and the line of succession secured. It does not mean endless joy, personal freedom, or a life without hardship. It means they survived, they married, and they fulfilled their societal roles, however grim or demanding those roles might have been. The struggles of life, the inevitable conflicts, the illnesses, the losses, these were simply assumed to continue. The tales end where they do because the story, from a societal perspective, had reached its conclusion. The personal drama, the daily grind, the ongoing battle for survival, that was just life. You're now seeing the curtain pulled back, revealing the ongoing, unglamorous performance of daily existence behind the grand finale. You've ventured through the thorny thickets of royal expectations and the pragmatic realities of happily ever after, recognizing that the veneer of fairy tale bliss often hid a far more complex and demanding existence. The forest around you, once a symbol of wild, untamed magic, now feels like a vast stage where countless untold dramas of survival played out as the sun continues its slow arc across the sky, casting the ancient trees in a warm yet still eerie glow. Your thoughts turn to the other key players in these narratives, the parents. In the sanitized versions, parents are either loving figures, absent victims, or clear-cut villains, but the original tales, much like real life, often portrayed them with a far greyer morality, driven by desperation, societal pressures, or even misguided beliefs that led to truly shocking fates for both themselves and their offspring. Consider the parents of Hansel and Gretel in the common telling. They are often portrayed as desperate but ultimately remorseful, yet, in the original folk versions, they are sometimes far less sympathetic. The mother, often the stepmother, is the one who repeatedly insists on abandoning the children in the deep, dark woods, driven by the gnawing pangs of famine and scarcity. This wasn't a one-time, desperate act It was a repeated, calculated attempt to rid themselves of mouths to feed. A decision born of unimaginable hardship. Imagine the internal struggle, the agonizing calculations of who might survive if fewer bodies consumed the meagre rations. This horrifying choice reflects a common historical fact in the times of severe economic distress or famine. Child abandonment, infanticide, or selling children into servitude were grim realities, not just plot devices. You can almost feel the cold grip of hunger that would force a parent to consider such an act. And there are the fathers who make truly questionable decisions. Remember the story of Donkey Skin, the king, in his grief over his deceased wife, promises to marry only a woman who fits her ring, when he finds that his own daughter is the only one who fits. He decides to marry her, while the tale frames this as a fulfillment of a vow. It's a truly disturbing premise, a father attempting to marry his own child. The princess's only escape is to demand impossible dresses like one the colour of the sky, or one the colour of the moon, and finally, a magical donkey skin that provides gold coins. This fantastical element allows her to flee and eventually find a true prince, but the original setup highlights a chilling reality in a patriarchal society. A father's power could extend to truly perverse desires, and a daughter's agency was virtually non-existent. This is a story about a parent's unchecked authority and a child's desperate flight from it, reflecting a historical period where familial control was absolute, and a parent's word was law. What about the good parents who meet grim ends? Think of Rapunzel's parents. They are so desperate for a radish from the witch's garden that the father, in his terror, promises their newborn child to the witch in exchange for more vegetables. This moment, often glossed over, speaks volumes about the power dynamic between the common folk and those perceived to have magical abilities or greater resources. It's a chilling reminder that poverty and desperate hunger could force parents into impossible bargains, sacrificing their children for immediate survival. This isn't just about a magical craving, it's about a society where the desperate might barter away their future for a single meal. A stark, visceral reminder of the constant fight against starvation. You might find yourself wondering, what kind of radishes were that good? And the evil stepmothers, they are a staple of fairy tales, from Cinderella to Snow White. While often portrayed as pure evil, their motivations, in a historical context, can sometimes be traced back to societal pressures, in societies where lineage and property were paramount. A stepmother might view the deceased wife's children as rivals to her own offspring, or as burdens on the family's resources. Her cruelty, though inexcusable, might stem from a desperate need to secure her own children's future in a world of scarcity and intense competition for resources. Historians still debate whether the prevalence of evil stepmothers in folklore reflects a genuine societal animosity towards second wives or serves as a narrative device to externalize anxieties about family structures and inheritance. Consider the common historical fact that infant and child mortality rates were astronomically high in pre-modern times. Parents often saw many of their children die before reaching adulthood. This brutal reality would undoubtedly harden hearts, make emotional attachments precarious, and perhaps, in some extreme cases, lead to a chilling pragmatism about the number of mouths that could realistically be fed. It's not an excuse for cruelty, but it offers a glimpse into a world where grief was a constant companion, and survival often trumped sentimentality. You can almost hear the quiet sobs of parents burying their young, a ubiquitous sound that would have echoed through every village. Then there are parents who are simply incompetent or naive, leading to tragic outcomes. In some versions of Little Red Riding Hood, the mother simply sends her young daughter alone into the dangerous woods, without proper warning or escort, to visit a sick grandmother. This seemingly simple act of sending a child on an errand becomes a grave error in judgment, highlighting the ever-present dangers outside the safety of the home and the lack of a modern understanding of child protection. An obscure detail from some early versions is that the mother might have been too ill or burdened herself to go, underscoring the relentless pressure on women to manage the household and care for the sick, even at great risk to their children. Even the good parents, once their children are grown, often face their own struggles. They age, become infirm, and are sometimes neglected or abandoned by their adult children. The fairy tale ending rarely extends to the parents, who often fade into the background once the hero or heroine achieves their happily ever after. Their lives continue, often filled with the same drudgery and hardship that defined their younger years, with no magical intervention to ease their burdens. This serves as a stark reminder that life's struggles don't just magically disappear with a wedding. You might even find yourself thinking, poor old Mr. and Miss Charming, still trying to make ends meet in their golden years. So, as you walk through this historical forest, the concept of parental love in these tales takes on a much darker hue. It's not always unconditional or pure. It's often entangled with survival, societal pressure, economic necessity, and sometimes a chilling display of desperation or even cruelty. The parents in these stories are complex figures, products of their harsh environments, making choices that, while horrific to our modern sensibilities, were sometimes rooted in the brutal realities of their existence. You're seeing that the family unit, often depicted as a sanctuary, could also be a source of profound danger and heartbreaking compromises. You've explored the intricate and often brutal roles of parents in these ancient narratives, understanding that their choices were frequently driven by the chilling calculus of survival rather than idealized love. The forest around you, now fully awake with the hum of insects and the distant calls of birds, feels less like a fantastical setting and more like the very real, untamed wilderness our ancestors navigated daily. This brings us to another critical, yet often overlooked, aspect of these original fairy tales: the sheer, raw struggle for survival in a truly wild world. The dangers in these stories weren't just metaphorical, they were actual threats that stalked every step of life outside the relative safety of village walls. Imagine being lost in this forest. As you conceptually are right now, your smartphone has no signal, your perfectly filtered water bottle is empty, and your designer hiking boots are offering little protection against the jagged rocks and unseen creatures. In the historical context of these tales, this isn't a weekend camping trip gone wrong, it's a terrifying, life-or-death situation. Wolves, bears, and other predators weren't just abstract threats from a storybook, they were real. Hungry beasts that regularly stalked the edges of human settlements, preying on livestock and, if the opportunity arose, unwary travellers. The fear of being eaten alive was a palpable, daily anxiety. You can almost feel the primal terror when you hear a snap of a twig behind you, knowing it might not be a friendly squirrel. Beyond the animal kingdom, there was the wilderness itself. Forests were vast, uncharted territories full of treacherous terrain, hidden bogs, and dense undergrowth that could disorient even the most experienced tracker. Getting lost wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. Without maps, GPS, or even well-maintained roads, a wrong turn could lead to starvation, exposure, or falling prey to those who hid within the shadows. Bandits and outlaws often used these wild spaces as their havens, adding a human layer of danger to the natural threats. A common historical fact is that many medieval roads were little more than dirt tracks, often overgrown and difficult to navigate, making long-distance travel incredibly perilous. Consider the characters who must venture into these untamed spaces. Little Red Riding Hood, navigating the woods alone, Hansel and Gretel, abandoned to the mercy of the elements. Even princes and knights, when on a quest, faced perilous journeys through wildlands. Their survival wasn't guaranteed by their virtue or lineage. It depended on their practical skills, Their cunning, and often sheer luck. They had to be able to find edible plants and avoid poisonous ones, build a rudimentary shelter, make a fire, and constantly be on guard. You might be good at ordering takeout, but could you snare a rabbit and skin it for dinner? The elements themselves were formidable adversaries. A sudden storm could turn a gentle stream into a raging torrent, wash away a path, or bring down deadly lightning. The bitter cold of winter could be as fatal as any monster, slowly claiming lives through exposure and frostbite. Heat waves, though less emphasized in northern European tales, could parch land and bring drought. The constant battle against nature wasn't a noble struggle, it was a gritty, relentless grind. An obscure detail from historical accounts is how often communities were wiped out, not by war, but by successive bad harvests or extreme weather events, forcing desperate migrations into the wilderness. And it wasn't just grand adventures that brought people into contact with these dangers. Daily life, for many, involved interacting with the wilderness. Peasants had to venture into forests to gather firewood, hunt small game, or collect wild berries. Shepherds grazed their flocks on open pastures, constantly vigilant against predators, even for those in fortified castles. The supplies often came from lands that required traversing dangerous routes. The fear of what lay beyond the immediate safety of the village perimeter was deeply ingrained. You might chuckle at the idea of a medieval delivery service, but imagine the perils of that job. Historians still debate whether the pervasive presence of monsters in folklore wolves, giants, dragons were purely allegorical representations of human evils, or if they also served as exaggerated warnings about the very real dangers of the natural world and the predatory aspects of wild animals, perhaps even reflecting encounters with large, aggressive beasts that are now extinct in many regions. The line between myth and ecological reality was often blurred, with monstrous tales reinforcing caution. So, when you hear of a character simply going into the woods or crossing a mountain, understand that this was a monumental undertaking, fraught with peril at every turn. Their survival was a testament not to magic, but to resilience, resourcefulness, and a deep, often brutal, understanding of the natural world. These narratives of survival, stripped of their fantastical elements, offer a chilling glimpse into the everyday struggles faced by our ancestors. You are now seeing the true face of the wild, not as a backdrop for adventure, but as a relentless, unforgiving force that shaped lives and determined fates. You've traversed the perilous realpolitik of ancient marriages and the raw survival struggles against the unforgiving wild, each step stripping away another layer of the comforting illusions that once cloaked these tales. The sun, now beginning its descent, casts long, dancing shadows through the trees, making the familiar shapes of branches seem like reaching claws. This shifting light brings us to another foundational element of these original narratives, the presence of magic. Not as a whimsical trick, but as a visceral, often terrifying force, deeply intertwined with ancient beliefs, superstitions, and the very real practice of folk magic and witchcraft. In a world where scientific understanding was rudimentary, the inexplicable was attributed to forces beyond human comprehension, making magic a potent, often fearful, aspect of daily life. Consider the witches. In modern versions, they might be ugly but cartoonish, easily defeated, but in the original tales, and in the minds of the people who first told them, they were terrifying figures, often embodying deep-seated societal fears. They weren't just hags with green skin, they were practitioners of a dark art, capable of truly malevolent acts. Think of the witch in Hansel and Gretel, not just luring children with gingerbread, but fattening them up for the literal purpose of cannibalism. You can almost smell the roasting flesh, a truly sickening aroma, a stark reminder of the most primal human fear. This isn't just a children's villain, is the embodiment of societal anxiety about famine, the breakdown of community, and the dark side of human nature pushed to its extreme. A common historical fact is that beliefs in witchcraft and malevolent magic were widespread and deeply held across Europe for centuries, leading to the persecution and execution of countless individuals, particularly women, accused of such practices. And the enchantments themselves, they weren't usually pretty spells that fixed everything. They were curses, transformations and grim prophecies that twisted lives into agonizing knots. Consider the spinning wheel in Sleeping Beauty, cursed to prick the princess's finger. This isn't just a prop, it's an instrument of fate, a tangible representation of an unavoidable doom. The power of a curse, once uttered, was believed to be almost inescapable, shaping destiny in a way that defied all logic or effort. You might even find yourself wishing for a modern undo button. But in this world, once the magic was set, it was set. What about the helpful magic? Even that came with a price or a dark origin. Remember the birds that help Cinderella or the doves that peck out the stepsister's eyes? These aren't just cute animals. In many folk beliefs, birds were seen as messengers from the spirit world, or even as spirits themselves, embodying a kind of ancient, often harsh, justice. Their actions are not cute acts of kindness, but rather the execution of a grim, supernatural retribution. An obscure detail from some early folklore is the belief that certain animals, particularly ravens or owls, were directly linked to witches or dark omens, making their presence deeply unsettling. The line between magic and superstition was incredibly blurry. People genuinely believed in omens, charms, and the power of rituals to influence their lives. If a crop failed, it might be due to a witch's curse. If a child fell ill, it could be the evil eye. People relied on folk healers, herbalists, and sometimes outright charlatans, because formal medicine was primitive and often ineffective. Their practices were deeply embedded in the magical worldview, with remedies often involving incantations, specific planetary alignments, or animal parts. Historians still debate whether the widespread reliance on folk magic and superstition in daily life served as a coping mechanism for an unpredictable world, or actively hindered the development of scientific reasoning. Even the seemingly benign magical objects had a darker side: a magic mirror, a wishing well, a talking animal. These weren't just convenient plot devices. They represented gateways to the unknown, forces that could grant wishes, but often with unforeseen and terrible consequences. The very act of engaging with magic was a dangerous gamble, a pact with forces beyond one's control. You could wish for riches and end up with a curse, or wish for love and find yourself bound to a monster. The belief in such unpredictable power made every interaction with the supernatural fraught with anxiety. It's like clicking agree on a terms and conditions page you haven't read, except the consequences are far more severe. Think about the psychological impact of living in such a world. Every strange occurrence, every unexplained illness, every stroke of bad luck could be attributed to malevolent magic. This fostered a climate of fear and suspicion, where neighbours might accuse each other of witchcraft, leading to terrible consequences. The Salem witch trials, centuries later, are a chilling example of what happens when such beliefs combine with social paranoia and lack of legal protections. The air itself felt thick with unseen forces, good and evil, constantly at play. So, when you encounter magic in these original tales, understand that it's not the sparkly, feel-good kind from your childhood. It's a primal, often terrifying force that reflects a world steeped in deep-seated beliefs, superstitions, and a constant awareness of the precarious balance between the seen and unseen realms. It's the magic of curses, pacts, and dark transformations, born from a profound human need to explain the inexplicable and to find some measure of control in a harsh, unpredictable world. You are seeing magic as it truly was, a powerful, often dangerous, and deeply unsettling aspect of pre-modern life, far from the benign enchantment of happily ever after. You've delved into the terrifying realities of magic and superstition, recognizing that what once seemed whimsical was, for our ancestors, a potent and often malevolent force. The afternoon sun now casts long, dramatic shadows across the forest floor, making the familiar woods feel like a stage for inevitable, chilling conclusions. This brings us to perhaps the most stark departure from our modern. Sanitized fairy tales, the original happy endings, were anything but. Forget the wedding bells and the joyful final kiss. Many of these narratives concluded with graphic retribution, prolonged suffering, or bleak uncertainty, reflecting a world that rarely offered clean resolutions or universal justice. Consider the fate of the wicked in these older versions. They weren't just banished or allowed to fade away. The punishments were often poetic in their brutality, designed to fit the perceived crime with agonizing precision. Remember the stepsisters in Cinderella, who mutilated their feet in some tellings. It's not just the doves pecking out their eyes at the wedding. As we discussed, it's a prolonged descent into blindness and poverty, forcing them to beg for sustenance, stumbling through life in permanent darkness as a direct consequence of their envy and deceit. You can almost feel the grit of the dirt beneath their sightless feet, a constant reminder of their fallen status. This brutal and public retribution served as a stark moral warning, emphasizing that wickedness would not go unpunished, and that divine or magical justice was often incredibly harsh. Then there's the infamous end of the evil queen in Snow White. We touched upon it earlier, but it bears repeating in its full, agonizing detail. She isn't just defeated, she's invited to Snow White's wedding, a forced appearance that adds a layer of psychological torment. There, she is made to put on red-hot iron shoes and dance until she dies. Imagine the searing pain, the smell of burning flesh, the screams, the frantic, involuntary movements as her body succumbs to the excruciating heat. It's a spectacle of torture, a public execution designed to instill terror and delight in the onlookers. This wasn't merely a consequence, it was a deliberate act of vengeance, a visceral climax to the story, reflecting a historical period where public shaming and brutal corporal punishment were common forms of justice. An obscure detail from some academic analyses suggests that the imagery of fire was often associated with purification and the burning away of evil, lending a ritualistic undertone to her gruesome demise. Even seemingly less villainous characters face grim fates. What about the original ending of Little Red Riding Hood in some of the oldest European versions? There is no woodcutter, no last-minute rescue. After the wolf tricks Red into eating her grandmother and getting into bed, she uses her wits to escape. She asks to go outside to relieve herself, and then simply runs away. There's no grand triumph, no justice for the grandmother. Red Riding Hood's happy ending is simply survival, a stark and sudden break from the horror, leaving you with the chilling thought of the wolf still out there, and the lingering trauma for the girl. This non-heroic escape highlights a pervasive historical reality. Vulnerable individuals often had to rely solely on their cunning to survive, and justice was rarely guaranteed. Historians still debate whether this type of open-ended, unresolved conclusion was meant to emphasize the ongoing dangers of the world or to highlight the individual's resourcefulness in the face of insurmountable odds. Consider how often characters in these original tales face permanent disfigurement or disability. The blinded prince in some Rapunzel versions, wandering for years before his sight is restored by magical tears. The various figures who are cursed with animal forms, forced to endure prolonged periods of monstrous existence. These aren't just temporary inconveniences, they are profound transformations that alter their very being. reflecting a world where physical ailments were often irreversible and deeply stigmatizing. The idea of a character simply snapping back to normal after a traumatic magical event is a very modern construct, and for those who did achieve a happy ending, it was often shadowed by the preceding trauma. Think of the psychological scars. Cinderella, after years of abuse, Sleeping Beauty, waking up to children she didn't know, born of an assault. Even if they found love and power, the emotional weight of their past experiences would linger. There was no medieval therapy or concept of PTSD. You simply endured, suppressed, and carried on. The idea of a perfectly adjusted life after profound suffering is a fantasy born of modern psychology, not historical reality. You might even chuckle at the thought of a medieval therapist trying to unpack centuries of unresolved family drama. The very concept of a clean resolution, where all evil is vanquished and suffering ends, is a product of Enlightenment era thought and later Victorian sensibilities, aiming to instill clear moral lessons in children. The original tellers of these tales lived in a far more chaotic world, where good and evil were often intertwined, justice was arbitrary, and suffering was an unavoidable part of the human condition. Their stories reflected this messy reality, offering catharsis through gruesome vengeance, or simply illustrating the relentless struggle to survive. So, as the last rays of sunlight fade, casting long, unsettling shadows that dance across your path, understand that the endings of these original tales were not designed to make you feel warm and fuzzy. They were designed to resonate with a primal understanding of justice, to acknowledge the brutal realities of life and death, and to reinforce the idea that actions had consequences, often dire and unforgiving ones. You are now seeing the true, unvarnished conclusion. To many of these narratives, a chilling finality that leaves little room for doubt, and even less for simplistic notions of happily ever after. You've journeyed through the raw, unvarnished truths of fairy tales, from the pragmatic brutality of their beginnings to the often gruesome final acts. The sun has finally dipped below the horizon, and the forest is now enveloped in a deep, hushed twilight, its familiar outline softened by the encroaching darkness. This quiet descent brings us to the final contemplation of these tales, stripped of their pretty illusions, still worth anything to us today, and can we still, knowing the brutal realities, allow ourselves to dream of happily ever after? The answers, much like the original stories, are more complex than a simple yes or no. You might feel a sense of disillusionment, the sweet dreams of childhood shattered by the harsh light of historical reality. No perfect princes, no pure princesses, no magic wands fixing everything with a sparkle. Instead, you've seen desperation, political manoeuvring, societal oppression, and visceral violence. You've encountered characters who are products of their time, driven by hunger, fear, and the relentless grind of survival. This isn't the stuff of lullabies, it's the stuff of nightmares. Sometimes, but even in their raw, unedited forms, these stories hold immense value. They're not just tales, they are cultural artifacts, echoes from a time when life was truly a daily struggle. They reflect the fears, hopes, and moral frameworks of our ancestors. They offer a window into how people coped with famine, disease, injustice, and the constant threat of the unknown. When you hear about children being abandoned in the woods, it's not just a horrific plot point, it's a chilling reminder of the Malthusian realities faced by impoverished families. When you hear of a witch consuming children, it speaks to a primal fear of starvation and predatory forces in a world where food was never guaranteed. These tales, in their original darkness, provided a safe space to explore the very real terrors of existence. They were cautionary tales, not just about wolves in the forest, but about the human capacity for cruelty, envy, and desperation. They taught lessons about resilience, resourcefulness, and the need for cunning to survive. Little Red Riding Hood escaping by her wits, or Jack outsmarting the giant. These aren't just fantasy. They're allegories for the underdog using intellect to overcome overwhelming power, a theme that resonates deeply even today. You might even feel a newfound respect for these characters, seeing them not as naive innocents, but as gritty survivors. A common historical fact is that folklore and oral traditions often serve as a collective memory, preserving societal norms, fears, and wisdom across generations, even if consciously recognized or not. These stories are a part of that vast, shared human experience. They show us that despite the immense technological and social progress we've made, some fundamental aspects of the human condition endure: the desire for belonging, the fear of loss, the struggle for agency, and the search for meaning in a chaotic world. And what about happily ever after? Knowing what you know now, can you still believe in it? Perhaps not as a simplistic, eternal state of bliss free from all troubles, but maybe, just maybe, it can be redefined. Perhaps happily ever after was never about the absence of hardship, but about the endurance of hope despite it. It was about finding brief moments of peace and contentment amidst the chaos. It was about forging alliances, building families, and creating community in a world that often sought to tear them apart. An obscure detail from some literary analyses suggests that the true magic in many of these older tales wasn't about wishing problems away, but about the characters' internal transformation in response to adversity. It was the resilience they found within themselves, the lessons they learned, or the community they built that truly secured their future, rather than a whimsical wave of a wand. Historians still debate whether the ultimate function of these grim tales was to instill conformity through fear, or to empower individuals by demonstrating that, even in the bleakest circumstances, cunning and courage could lead to survival. So, yes, you can still dream of happily ever after, but perhaps your dream is now richer, deeper, and more grounded in reality. It acknowledges the struggles, the flaws, the dangers that lie beneath the surface. It understands that true happiness isn't a destination without obstacles, but a journey through them, armed with grit, wisdom, and the enduring human spirit. You're not just passively absorbing a story anymore, you're engaging with the profound, complex history woven into its very fabric. And now, good night, and have a sweet dream.